Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Michael Pawelke, president of Briercrest College and Seminary, to discuss his experiences in leading changes at Briercrest, a story that will encourage and challenge you in your leadership context. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we are honored to have as our guest this week, Michael Pawelke. Michael is the president of Briercrest College and Seminary in Caronport, Saskatchewan, Canada, which is right next to the booming metropolis of Moose Jaw. And maybe we could have an episode on the history of Moose Jaw. It's actually a pretty fascinating little town. But that's another episode. But prior to Michael serving there as president, he served as the senior pastor in the church context in Eastern Canada. But I've invited Michael in to discuss his experiences coming from the church context and leading significant change at Briercrest. And a special shout out to Moody Bible Institute as our sponsor for this episode. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Philip. It's good to be with you today, and thank you for all you do for biblical higher education.
Absolutely. And I should also mention that Michael serves on the ABHE Board of Directors and does a great job of representing our 19 Canadian members. And so that's what we're actually going to kind of talk about somewhat in this episode, as there's a lot of similarities between Canada and the United States, but there are also some significant differences. But before we get into our conversation there, Michael, as you reflect back over your ministry experiences, share with us a defining moment that God used that has kind of propelled you forward to where you are today.
Well, let me take you back to when I was actually a student right here at Briercrest, my second year. And just quickly for context, I was not raised in a Christian home. I trusted Christ through a little Gideon New Testament that had been given in elementary school. And so I wasn't raised with any sort of biblical connection, Christian connections. So when I came to Christ as a young teen, God wonderfully led me to a strong Bible-believing church. And even as a young teen, with such little biblical orientation, but I felt a call, felt a pull to Christian education, to ministry of some kind. Ended up at Briercrest, plunged into my time at Briercrest. But in my second year, I was in a gathering, and the dean of students put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Michael, are you going out for student leadership next year?" And that was a defining epiphany for me, because while I had a deep burden and interest and pull to ministry of some kind, perhaps teaching, perhaps missions, but when he looked at me and said, "Have you thought of leadership?" That began to cause the wheels to turn a little bit more clearly in the direction of leadership. So that really was a defining moment, wow. And I often share that story with others.
Isn't it amazing to me? We've on this podcast, I've referred to them as divine appointments that God lays on our heart to encourage people. You never know what a word of encouragement will do to somebody, and that was divinely set up. And that was the word that you needed at that point that really set a trajectory for you forward for the rest of your life.
Oh, precisely. And I've told that dean my story, and he likely doesn't even remember it, but It was hugely impactful.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. So who would ever thought back then that you'd be a college president today?
Indeed.
Yeah. You serve as the president at one of our 19 Canadian member institutions. And from your experiences, and we kind of referenced this at the top of the show, there are a lot of similarities. When I traveled to Canada, and I've been there now a number of times and really gotten to enjoy any time that I'm up in Canada, a lot of similarities. You see, along the roadside, you see a lot of the same stores. You see Walmarts and Targets and all of that. Though you don't see too many Dunkin' Donuts, you see Tim Hortons instead, which I love their donut holes, but that's another story. But there's also a lot of differences. So from your experiences, what are the differences of the Canadian context from the U.S. context in leading institutions for biblical higher education?
Well, as you say, there's all kinds of similarities, and those similarities grow and the differences slowly decrease. But there are some cultural differences that really we have to appreciate and be aware of. And I'll just mention a few, Philip, that I think are real. Mm-hmm. And one is that in the Canadian context, there just seems to be a more self-depreciating approach to leadership versus a more of a confident, robust approach to leadership. And let me just put a little bit of more perspective to that. It's not that Canadians can't be proud, but their pride just comes across a little bit differently, and that self-depreciating kind of, we say thank you all the time, but it is real. I think in general, in Canadian contexts, we're generally smaller institutions, smaller churches, smaller schools, smaller budgets, smaller buildings. And again, except for some of our larger urban centers, I think that would be the case. And then you compare that to the American context where there is larger thinking, more impressive campuses, more generous budgets. And again, I'm speaking very broadly here, but I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And certainly our immediate context, our surrounding thinking, our cultural mindset would play a role. I think in Canada, we're much less politically engaged, or at least less politically vocal, versus Americans that are somewhat more so, if I could put it that way. I think because evangelicals are in a minority here in Canada, a significant minority here in Canada, we really have to work together. And so while there are all kinds of interdenominational ABHE schools and educational institutions like ours, I think in the Canadian context, we would have a lot of diversity. I know here at Briercrest, we, at our highest point, probably would have had as many as 50 or 60 different denominations represented. Again, highest view of Scripture.
Right.
But because we have such smaller numbers, we don't have the luxury of being really focused in our theological, denominational, ecclesiastical kinds of context.
Yeah.
I think in Canada, we've lived longer with the advancement of secularism, and we've lived with our reduced cultural impact for a number of decades now, whereas, again, no doubt diminished, but the church is still a big player in American contexts.
Yeah,
and we've acknowledged that we have lost so much of that influence over the last number of years.
I've often thought that Canada seems ahead from where we are, a little bit more closer towards a European secular context, but the U.S. isn't too far behind with that. But
well, you're catching up quickly, that's for sure, or maybe declining quickly.
Yeah, right. Which to me, there's an encouragement in that you're still able to lead an institution of biblical higher education within that context.
Yes, indeed. We're grateful for that. We have and this might come up a little bit later, we have a very positive relationship with the Ministry of Advanced Education. That's our provincial political body. And so we've been able to stick handle that well. And as much as we are recognized and I think in measure respected by our government, thankfully, we've not had pressure to become something otherwise or inconsistent with our beliefs.
I'd say that's one of a pretty significant difference, that while you're not vocally politically active like some institutions may be in the United States, that local relationship with government is big. I know that for a number of the institutions where it just varies by province, right? That, in one area, the relationship looks fundamentally different, but that's a key relationship locally for you.
Yes, absolutely so.
Yeah. Any other differences?
Well, I think this would be somewhat of a difference that we would feel in that we're some 90 years old. We began as a traditional Bible institute during that whole movement in the 30s, 20s and 30s. But in recent years, we have developed a number of programs. We have 8 authorized degrees. That's our language for university degrees, recognized degrees. And I think on the Canadian scene, we would have just a handful of Christian universities, CCCU universities, but even fewer ABHE schools with university recognition as well. And so in the Canadian context, we have fewer schools like us, which are a Bible school ethos, with recognized university level education. So we have to lean heavily to our friends to the south to understand some of those uniquenesses.
Yeah. Now in Canada, there really isn't an equivalence of accreditation, correct? Like we have
No,
in the
there
US.
isn't.
Yeah. And there's no centralized Department of Education.
No, it's all provincially governed.
So curious, what would be the motivation for institutions in Canada to seek ABHE accreditation?
Well, I think credentialing is hugely significant in that it provides accountability. And in that accountability, and I think in our cultural context, accountability only helps our reputation. And so to say that we're accountable to a larger body, a governing body, a credentialing body, gives us increased trustworthiness. And so I think there's tremendous value. We've been accredited for some 50 years, even though we've been only provincially accredited for some 10 or 11 years now.
Yeah. And I've had the opportunity to be up there and visit the campus. Was up there just actually a couple of weeks ago. And Briercrest specifically, you have a college, but you also have a K-12 school. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we have a seminary, and then we have high school education. We no longer have the elementary school, but we do have the high school.
Okay.
And so we would oversee all three institutions. Now, our high school would have some very unique attachments to the provincial school board. The college would have university credentials with 8 of our degrees, but not have government funding, or at least not of funding of any significance. And then our seminary would also be ATS affiliated, but again, no funding.
Okay. And when I was up there, you're telling me a little bit about ice hockey. It's Canada, right? That's a big deal. And your high school particularly competes in a pretty competitive league or association.
Yes, and we have a partnership with the Prairie Hockey Academy, and we've got 4 teams there, and they are all over Western Canada competing at a very elite level, and we're pleased with what they're doing.
Which is such a great mechanism to bring students in and in many cases introduce them to Jesus. And I attended the chapel. You had a combined chapel where you had your high school students and your college students together, and very clearly the gospel message was presented.
It's a great opportunity to be connecting with families, to be connecting with elite athletes, and through those teams have a reputation for Christ.
Yeah, fantastic. So you've recently led your institution, Briercrest, through some significant changes, really focused in on connecting your mission to what you do. Talk to us a little bit about that process.
So let me take you back to sort of one significant way when I first came, and then to a more recent drilling down with greater intensity and some changes. So I've been here just over 11 years now, and one of the things that we observed needed to take place was some brand clarification. In those years when we were seeking to increase our quality of education, seek out provincial accreditation and authorization, we placed a lot of energy into that, raised the standards of our faculty and our academic curriculum. But in that process, we also changed our name from Briercrest Bible College to Briercrest College and Seminary. And we did that largely for the sake of our mission initiatives. We didn't want to have Bible on the parchments for students who are going into some hot spots around the world. However, when we made those changes, we didn't communicate with our constituencies sufficiently. And so there began to be a little bit of a drift in terms of appreciation or understanding of what we're all about. And so we've sought to put more energy on clarity of our brand clarification, because there was some brand ambiguity. And so probably the most significant thing in that is for our constituency to really understand what our mission is. And our mission is simply this: Briercrest is a community of learning. That's what we are. That we call students to seek the kingdom of God, to be profoundly shaped by the scriptures, and to be formed spiritually and intellectually for lives of service. And if I were to exegete that, I'd say we're Christ-centered, we're Bible-anchored, and we're small M ministry focused. But we didn't want that to be just espoused theory. We want that to be a theory in use. And so to really communicate that this is who we are. In fact, our actual mission doesn't differ that much from what we said some 89 years ago. but we need to clarify that with our constituency. So constant brand identification, brand clarification, brand energy, brand understanding is ever before us, but we really put some energy into that when I came. More recently, we've been really addressing some programmatic as well as some financial challenges. Let me just again put this into context. The Canadian Evangelical Church has seen some rapid decline in recent years. And with that, we're all fishing from a shrinking pond. And so like most schools, we're not quite 80-20, but 80-85% of our budget, our revenue is from tuition, room and board, and then 15-18% is from donations. And we also know, paralleling that, we on a macro level, education is becoming increasingly expensive. In fact, I can recall when I was a student at Briercrest, I had summer jobs making minimum wage in factories, and I could come here and write a check and pay for my whole year and have enough money to buy a tube of toothpaste. But I could finish the year debt free. That can't happen anymore. So we've seen the increase of educational costs, and we keep expanding programs. And some of our programs are quite expensive. Right? You mentioned high school hockey, but we have 5 varsity teams, and we're in Saskatchewan. We play in the Alberta League, which is for our American friends, that's a whole province over. And so every time we play, we've got a 5 to 8 hour bus ride plus hotel. And so we've got all these increasing costs. And so we've had to face some conversations related to right sizing. And right sizing isn't the most attractive word, but it really is an appropriate word because so often we keep adding programs and not retiring those programs which are less effective or not as effective as they once were. And of course, as being a social sector organization, our desired output isn't profit, it's life change. But nevertheless, we can't keep doing what we're doing and losing money in the process. And so while our outcome isn't profit, it's leaders for the church, it's bearing witness and bringing benefit, it's life change, but we need to do that in a fiscally responsive way. And so we've been in those right-sizing conversations where we're trying to give ourselves focus, do fewer things, do them well, and try to trim down those things which are less strategic. Maybe we're strategic at one point, but are less so today.
Yeah. So there's so many leadership lessons in that response that you gave there that I want to call out a little bit. First of all, the idea of being on mission, clearly articulating what your mission is, obviously from a marketing perspective, but also for the organization internally to know what they're about. It's one thing to have a marketing strategy and all of the right taglines and all of that. Talk to us about how long did it take to get the organization back on track or aligned with that clearer mission?
Well, I suppose that's a continuing conversation. And as I'm answering your question, that's probably the most honest answer I can give you in that it's ongoing.
Yeah.
In our context, we like to say that our educational approach is built on 3 key pillars. One would be biblical theological. The other would be liberal arts learning. And the third pillar would be praxis or life skills, professional skills, marketplace skills. And so in our context, we try to build an educational model which rests in all 3 of those. Mm-hmm. But as you know, some are going to pull to one particular leg. Mm-hmm. And so to try to keep that balance ever before us is a continuous mandate that we have. So that's what we internally we seek to push, mm-hmm. and certainly model that with our students in our educational approach.
Yeah, and it's a great response because from a leadership perspective, when you do cast vision and articulate a more precise mission statement to get everybody on board with that, you never arrive. It's a continual process. It's seen in evaluation. It's seen in hiring. It's seen in firing. It impacts every aspect of it, and vision leaks. Right? You got to keep coming back around so that people understand. Because if not, iteratively, what happens over time is you become less precise in your mission, and then the chance of a mission drift happens. There's another key lesson here, leadership lesson that I think higher education is not necessarily good at, and that's taking things away. We're very good at adding things. We're not very good at taking things away. When I say take things away, I'm talking academic programs. Oftentimes people are associated with that. Talk to us about your experience with that. That's not an easy thing to do, but critical for survival.
Well, one thing that was helpful for us is we did bring a consultant to help us look at our programs with ruthless objectivity.
Yeah.
Of course, we start new programs with great heart and energy, and usually people attached to it. And then when those programs run their course, or they don't prove to be quite as successful as we hoped, of course, the benefit of a consultant is sometimes to tell you things you already know, but it's outside source. It's a third party that's helping you see that with a greater lens of objectivity. So that's been a helpful initiative in that process. But then there's just the challenging conversations, those slow conversations with various academic planning and other programmatic initiatives as well, where you're having those conversations and slowly, caringly, carefully bringing people on board where they come to the realization that, I can see how this is just simply costing us more than it's generating revenue. And again, our goal isn't profit, but we need to manage ourselves fiscally responsibly.
One of the strategies that I've seen effective, especially when you come in as president, you inherit the entire enterprise. And so you weren't part of the decision-making process for anything that was, but now you have to make decisions about, do we continue those things? But you can set a trajectory forward too. And one of the practices that I've seen to be very effective is to actually, whenever you're proposing a new program, a new direction, to actually in that proposal, put a sunset clause to say, look, our intent is to do this. And we want to have this program, and we have done the market research, and we think it's going to be a profitable program for the organization. But we put this clause in here that says, look, if it doesn't meet certain thresholds by certain points in time, we all understand that could mean that we pull the plug on what we thought was going to be a good program. That way, at the onset, everybody has that, not as a fear motivation, but a recognition that, look, we try things and sometimes those things may not necessarily be successful, and we're just not going to keep it around because it's attached to a person. That's
great wisdom, Philip. I'm making notes on this because this is going to go into our strategic plan, no doubt.
There you go. Love it. So you made the transition from a senior pastor to a college president. And by the way, just and you've been at it for 10 years, correct?
Yes, 11 years.
11 years. Your understanding of the complexity of higher education comes through in the revisioning that you've done, the closing down of programs, starting of programs. So you've really led effectively. But talk to us about that transition. What skill sets transferred easily? And then conversely, what are the new skills that you had to learn making that transition from senior pastor of a church to college president?
Yeah, happy to comment on that. Great question, Philip. So I'm a graduate of Briercrest, then I went to Dallas Seminary, and then chipped away at education. But I was a pastor for 30 years. And while I was a pastor, I was invited to be on the board for Briercrest. So this is my alma mater. I love the place. This place truly transformed my life. And then when the previous president stepped aside and the board asked me to consider taking on this role, of course, I hoped I wasn't naive thinking, well, the academy will be somewhat different, but I'm thinking, how different can it be? And I was in for quite a baptism, that's for sure. But certainly, leadership is leadership. Your vision casting, your administrating programs, people skills always matter, loving and caring for people. And now, instead of a pastoral team or a congregation, it was staff, students, alumni, donors, although those kinds of relationships are certainly transferable. I know one of the things I was not looking forward to was fundraising. And again, college presidents, they're involved with a lot of fundraising. I'm probably on the road 35% of the time. And while I was dreading that, I now find that probably half of my lunch meeting visit or supper visit or coffee visit, half or 2/3 is often just talking about personal matters, because I can be a friend, a counselor, a pastor, a colleague in leadership, with somebody who's 2, 3, 5, 7 hours away, 10 hours away. And I'm a safe place for a person to share their heartaches, their challenges, their difficulties. And so in so many ways, I'm still a pastor. At least I serve in that kind of a capacity in some people's lives. So even fundraising still had a pastoral component. I do daily walkabouts in the institution. I have quite a, I don't want to say open door policy, but I'm very accessible both to students and to staff. And life is a relationship, right? And so relationships matter. And I want to be a godly example. I want to lead with integrity, and all of that is transferable. But what did strike me significantly was just the nature of hierarchy in the academy. So the church is much more flat. And even though I pastored a fairly large church, I had a significant pastoral team. Nevertheless, I could go to virtually any department, any gathering, and, the pastor's here, and I'd be welcomed, and my input would be welcomed. Whereas in a larger hierarchical organization where you've got VPs and deans and department heads and managers and coaches and assistant coaches, you parachute into a meeting, and the first thought is, why is he here? And so in my early days, I had some reorientation to take place because I found that I need to lead more thoughtfully through my VPs and through my deans and through my teams. And so that was certainly an adjustment for me. And I never was a controller, but I did like to ensure the problems were being solved. And now I've got to just release and just trust my team.
But at the same time, and I've observed you in leadership a couple times that I've been up there, that doesn't change necessarily who you are or your gift set. Like you have successfully brought a pastoral heart to leadership within a higher education organization. And that while things are different, there are still ways that you've been able to practice that gifting and not necessarily lose that part of who you are.
Well, thank you for saying that. I hope that's the case. And I certainly have no intention of losing that kind of demeanor, that kind of countenance. Another huge process for me to a growth curve for me was to fully appreciate just how powerful and influential faculty are. Whether you have a formal senate or not, faculty members, that they're your engine, right? And I say this respectfully, they're thoughtful. They're deeply committed to thorough research, to accuracy, to the discipline of their discipline. And they have strong opinions on almost everything, including leadership. And so, to navigate that carefully and thoughtfully and respectfully, the university bicameral model, which some of our schools are patterned after, or at least influenced by, can create a little bit of who's in charge here, and that can seep into an institution. And so I think that's something to be aware of and to navigate carefully. So there's got to be a proper understanding of the power and influence of faculty, but also an acknowledgement of the role of leadership. I mean, the church I pastored before was an urban context, largely business leaders were on my board. And business leaders are not impetuous, but they do seize opportunities. And so they make a plan and act. Change in the academy usually requires, 18 months and 3 white papers and 4 Senate meetings. And it's a much slower process. And my first year or two, I made some rapid changes that was a little too rapid. But at the same token, there needs to be mutuality where we've got to move forward here.
Yeah. And the reason I ask these questions is because a number of our institutions, when they're looking to hire a president, will often look to the church and make the assumption that the transition of a senior pastor or somebody who's on a pastoral team into higher education, it's one in the same organization. It's just simply not the case. There are just so many more complexities. Can it work? Absolutely, it can work. I think you're a demonstration of that, but it's something that you have to go into with eyes wide open. And
indeed, for sure.
You're a learner, and the fact that you're a learner demonstrates or could be perceived as vulnerability, weakness. And sometimes we bring our egos to the table, and now I'm the leader of this organization, and we're going to go this direction, and I'm not going to listen to anybody else, as a guard against the academy and all that's in the academy and the hierarchy that's there. And it's just such a unique, and you and I have had multiple conversations about it. It's just such a unique animal that you have to go into it very, very carefully and know those moments where you can take that step forward, and know those moments that you actually have to pull back a little bit and allow the organization to breathe through change. And I think you've struck that balance incredibly well. Listen, we have 1 minute left. This has been a fantastic conversation. We have a lot of younger listeners who are aspiring leaders. Reflecting back over your early days of leadership, what's one lesson that you learned that you'd like to share with those aspiring leaders?
Well, Philip, when I was a young leader, I devoured everything and anything that I could to develop skills. I read ferociously. I listened to tapes in my car. I took in conferences, and I was so consumed with learning leadership skills to be as effective as I possibly could. And while that matters, I've since come to believe that everything absolutely rises and falls on character. That is your platform of influence. And so my walk with God, my own self-awareness, my own self-understanding. There's a great quote that deeply impacted my life in my late 20s. James Thurber said, every person must, before they die, determine what they're running from, what they're running to, and why. And we got to figure that out, because we will bring our brokenness into the organization. Every person must, before they die, determine what they're running from, what they're running to, and why. And I think a lot of us, we do very good things for sometimes mixed motives. And that isn't to say we aren't accomplishing some good things too, but we want to function out of health. And so character absolutely matters. Sort of skill. Psalm 78:72 says, and David shepherded them with integrity of heart and skillful hands he led them. But I love the order of that. Integrity of heart, then skillful hands. And so character matters.
Well, you are a man of character, and certainly am blessed to know you. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experiences.
Great. Thanks, Philip. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And again, a special shout out to Moody Bible Institute. I'm certainly thankful for their partnership for this episode. Until next time, stay kingdom focused.